In this session, we'll be looking at a period of time known as the Great Awakening. And as we examine this period, what we're looking at is the origins of what will later be called evangelicalism. That essentially, with this period, we have a confluence of religious movements as well as kind of a umbrella type of ideology that we can call evangelical that really begins to shape a large portion of Protestantism in the United States. Now, as we will explore the rest of the history of the United States, evangelicalism will be one movement within that history that has a pretty important role. But before we get into talking about evangelicalism, it's perhaps important to start off by talking about what do we mean by the Great Awakening. As a term, we're referring to a period of intense revivalism that began in the late 1730s. And so usually the Great Awakening is dated between the 1730s and the 1740s. Now, this period was not known as the Great Awakening until the 1800s, when a man named Joseph Tracy, writing about these revivals, talked about this period as a Great Awakening. And what we mean by Great Awakening, or what we mean by revivalism, has to do with an increase in kind of a very intense emotionalism when it came to religion. Now, in a later lecture, when we talk about the developments related to Christianity and the Revolutionary War, we'll talk about how throughout the 18th century there is a general decline in religiosity to some extent and religious commitment in the colonies. And there were a lot of ministers who were concerned that people were becoming less Christian, were becoming disconnected to the church. And so, this becomes a very big concern that was preached against, was talked about. But there were these periods, including this one here that we're talking about, where there was this intense emotional change, where lots of people became interested in being a part of a Christian group, and as this developed, these revivals, as people became emotionally connected to the church, became more and more interested in participating in religious groups, particularly from the standpoint of the common person in the pew. They also and so there was this intense emotionalism that had kind of, decreased these great concerns that Christianity was on the decline. And so what you have here is an outgrowth of what we looked at the end of the section on the Puritans. That as the second and third generations after the Puritans developed, there was this decrease in religiosity, fewer people becoming church members, and so a lot of people, were concerned that religion was on decline. So much so that there were a lot of sermons during the time called Jeremiads, or what we call Jeremiads, which were essentially these appeals to people to be connected, to become church members, to condemn what they saw as kind of a lax approach to religion, and to call the people to return to God. Now, they've been referred to as Jeremiads in that they are very similar to some of the preaching of the biblical prophet Jeremiah, and some of the things that Jeremiah was doing in trying to call people back to Christianity. Now, what we see here is this emotional approach, this emphasis on the importance of correct living as an expression of the Christian faith, this concern for godly fellowship, as well as this increased emphasis on conversion, the need for conversion, having that identifiable experience. All of these kind of work together. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Great Awakening. Historians, however, have raised some important questions about this notion of a Great Awakening. As I mentioned, the name was used in the 1840s, and from the 1840s until the 1980s, 90s, there was a general way that American history, especially American religious history, was discussed, and it was about this Great Awakening, this great moment, the 1730s to the 1740s, where there's such a shift to religiosity. But as historians have pointed out, really throughout the middle to late 18th century, you have a variety of scattered revivals that take place. It's not a consistent period, a consistent history of this great revival that continues to go from the 1730s on. And in fact, there were revivals before this and revivals after this. Many people have pointed to kind of a general awakening that that continues throughout the 18th century at various times. So it's kind of problematic to talk about a Great Awakening as a self-contained type of period. Probably we could say that the heaviest revivalism was in the 1730s through the 1740s. But we should also recognize that at various points throughout the history of this period, that there are a lot of these things going on. In addition, I don't want it to sound like, this is only an American phenomenon. Similar things were going on across the Atlantic in England. And so, the Great Awakening is not just an American phenomenon. It's being replicated in other places as well. And so you have this rise of evangelicalism taking place both in England and in the colonies. But in many ways, the Great Awakening or awakenings is a good shorthand way to talk about this period, provided we understand, that it's a complicated term. It's not as simple as it might originally sound. So, what were the impacts? What was the impact of the Great Awakening? Well, in many respects, in the short term, the Great Awakenings brought a large example of division. There was a lot of division that took place as people variously lined up either for or against the awakening, the revivals. This took place in congregations, as individual congregations split over those that supported the revivals, those that were suspicious of the revivals. It led to divisions between ministers, as various ministers lined up on each side, either in support or against the revivals. Some believing that the revivals were a positive example of the Spirit moving in Christianity in the colonies, while others were less optimistic and believing that this was This wasn't necessarily the Spirit moving, that this was confusion and chaos. It also led to divisions between and within denominations. The Presbyterian Church, for example, split between new sides and old sides. So new side Presbyterianism supported the revivals, while old side Presbyterians were against the revivals. And you had other examples of that as well. Often there was a distinction made between old lights and new lights, where the new lights were open to the revivals, while the old lights were opposed to the revivals. So, there's a lot of division that takes place as people support or denounce the revivals, as people change denominations, right? There are a lot of people that were Congregationalists, which is a denomination that develops out of Puritanism. And so a lot of the people that were Congregationalists look at the Congregationalism of the time, in the 18th century, and feel like, this is just, it's too dry, it's too disconnected from an emotional standpoint. And so when these revivals start, they leave Congregationalism for the Baptists, for example, as one of these groups that really takes on the revivals. So in the short term, there was a lot of division that took place. In the longer term, there were some other transitions that took place that I think that we can kind of see in that. And one of those would be a variety of new preaching styles. We talked in the section on the Puritans about the ways in which preaching was pretty standard in the 18th century, in that, there was a general review of a specific text with an explanation. And after, kind of explaining what the text says, after that, the preacher moved on to talking about the doctrines within the specific text. And then after it, talking about the application or uses of that specific text. And so that was a pretty common style. But with the Awakening, you have, with that, because it's a very rational approach, a logical approach, it was focused on kind of intellectually convincing people of a variety of different doctrines and applications, etc. And they tended to be, at least from some of the records we have, rather dry sermons because they were so logically focused. But with the Awakenings, as various ministers preached sermons connected to the revivals, they became much more animated in their preaching. They became much more extemporaneous in that they weren't as tied to a set of prepared remarks. Previously to this point, a lot of sermons had been basically written out, or largely written out, and were read from. But a lot of the revivalist ministers started working towards preaching that wasn't tied to a specific manuscript with the sermon all written out, but would instead be kind of developed by the preacher as they were preaching. And a lot of the focus shifted from attempting to convince the mind to attempting to affect the emotions. There was this approach to try and get an emotional response from individuals rather than necessarily an intellectual response. This also changed the nature of public worship, as a lot of the revivalists began to travel to various places, and they weren't necessarily tied to any one congregation. Many of them were, but sometimes you have these itinerant preachers who are going from place to place. They wouldn't necessarily stay and preach within a church building, particularly as churches and denominations became opposed to these revivalists. They would bar them from preaching in their churches, and so they would preach outside, preach in the field, preach wherever they could find a spot. Other aspects of public worship changed as well, as not just the sermon being developed toward affecting the emotions, but as music, hymns began to be written that were more about, the kind of emotional connection with God. And we'll see much more of that in the 19th century, but essentially you have these changes to public worship. And then you also have, this development of this phenomenon known as revivalism, where you would have one of these preachers who attempted to incite the emotions and really kind of make an emotional impact, and were very successful at doing that, leading to a lot of conversions of people claiming Christianity, of people reconfirming their commitment to Christianity. And revivalism has maintained itself as a pretty prominent facet of American Christianity. And just the idea of holding a revival, of attempting to have these services at various times, either once a year or every couple of years, or sometimes more than once a year, became a pretty common feature. And even today, you will still hear of a church or denomination holding a revival. Now, it's less prominent today than it once was. But this idea of revivalism and looking for these moments where it's believed that the Spirit is moving to emotionally convict the listeners of their sinfulness and lead them to conversion becomes very, very prominent in American Christianity. So let's talk about some of these early developments. One of the first individuals who was rather prominent in the development of revivalism was a man named Theodore Frelinghuysen. He was a preacher in the Dutch Reformed Church, and he looked at his congregation, and this is in the 1720s or so, looked at his congregation and felt that they had become too satisfied with their situation. They were just going along their religion and just kind of doing the things of Christianity, but not very connected with Christianity. And Frelinghuysen also felt that a large number of his congregants looked at their religion more about their kind of Dutch nationality than really about being convicted Christians. And so he began to preach these sermons that emphasized the importance of conversion, specifically having a conversion experience, something that you could point to that would be this emotional development, this emotional experience, and you could demonstrate that this is why you were a Christian, because you had this experience. And so Frelinghuysen tended to do a lot of that type of preaching. Another group that was involved in these early revivals was a father and his sons, the Tennant family. William was the father, Gilbert and John were the sons. The one that's most remembered out of that is Gilbert Tennant. They were Presbyterians, and formed a seminary known as Log College in Western Pennsylvania. Today we would consider it New Jersey. William Sr. Was the father, and then Gilbert and John, and then also there was a William Jr. So there was three brothers. And Law College would eventually become would serve as some of the basis for the College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton. So they formed this ceremony. The focus of the ceremony for William Sr. is to train ministers to bring about conversion. Now remember, they're Presbyterians, so they're largely shaped by Calvinism. And so would have Frelinghuysen, as a Dutch Reformed pastor, also been shaped by Calvinism. And both of them, both this family and Frelinghuysen, as well as others that were interested in revivalism, would have emphasized that people are chosen by God either to be saved or to be lost, and that there really isn't anything that somebody can do about that. This is God's decision. But they believed, as did Calvin, that preaching was the means that God used to kind of bring about that transformation from being a depraved human being to being one of the elect. And so, despite their rather pessimistic views about what human beings could do to affect their salvation, they emphasize the importance of convicting people through preaching to have this conversion experience. So what essentially they're doing that will set the stage for the second Great Awakening is they are preaching as if an individual has a choice in the matter, even though they don't believe that that's the case. Right? And so they believe, well, okay, God is using preaching as the means by which he's going to bring about conversion. So we need to preach as if everybody has the possibility, but it will only be the elect, only be those that God has chosen that will respond. And, those are the people that the Holy Spirit will change their hearts to respond to the message in this general Calvinist type of view. And so in their sermons, they tended to stress sin and guilt. They, like Frelinghuysen, were very concerned about what they called the presumptuous security of professed Christians. The idea that they were, it was okay to just be a lukewarm Christian, right? To just show up to services, kind of live your life all right, but ultimately you're not really that committed to Christianity. And this is what the tenants saw as they looked out at their congregations, that there was a lack of any sort of internal transformation, of an inward commitment to Christianity by these individuals. And so that was a big focus of, trying to convict these people to move past this feeling of security, which again is somewhat connected with some Calvinist views. Although Calvin talked about, the perseverance of the saints, later Calvinists really emphasized what came to be shorthanded as once saved, always saved. And so, they pushed for this, this attempt to really bring about a change in the people that they were preaching to. Ultimately believing that no one became a Christian without coming to the terrifying realization one was not a Christian. Right? So you had to come to this view, this emotional view of realizing you were not a Christian. And if you didn't have that experience, you could not positively claim that you were a Christian if you had not had that deep emotional fear and recognition and realization that you were not Christian. Which Gilbert especially turned not just towards the person in the pew, but towards other ministers as well. Gilbert was very vocal, was very active in writing against what he called the unconverted ministry of these ministers who had not experienced these conversion experiences that the tenants were preaching, which of course led to a lot of opposition, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later part of the lecture here. The last of the early revivalists who are kind of getting things started here in this middle period is a man named Jonathan Edwards. Edwards has been referred to as America's greatest theologian, with some justification. Edwards was a prolific preacher, but also a prolific writer. Yale University Press has been working on publishing Edwards' writings, which would include his sermons. A lot of his sermons were written out as well. And there's over 25 volumes of his writings, just the most important ones, or what Yale considered the most important ones, which is based off of 100,000 handwritten pages. So very prolific preacher, in addition to a preacher. Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703 in Connecticut. His father was a minister. His mother's father, so his grandfather on his mother's side, was a minister as well. And so his family prepared him early in life to be a minister. It was kind of like that was the conclusion was you are going to go into the ministry, which he did. His father ran a school to prepare boys for college. A lot of college at the time, of course, was preparation for ministry. So early in his life, Edwards learned classical languages, he learned biblical languages, he studied philosophy, science, church history, so had a very broad background. In 1716, he entered college. It would later be called Yale, but at the time it wasn't called Yale. But that's kind of that's the college he goes through. In 1720, he graduated as valedictorian of his class, so high accolades, and began graduate studies to become a minister. But he still had a wide variety of interests. He was interested in the writings of John Locke, a British author who's remembered for his philosophy, but also wrote on religion and epistemology, the study of knowledge. He was interested in other philosophers. He was interested in scientists and science and scientists, and wrote a couple pieces about science. While still a student, he began preaching for a Presbyterian church in New York City. Most of his sermons have been described as warm, earnest, optimistic, emphasizing the beauty of God and the godly life. Now, Edwards, though, was also a very strong Calvinist who tended to emphasize that human beings were totally dependent upon God's grace. But just like the tenants and Frelinghuysen to some extent, he preached as if everyone could respond. In 1723, Edwards finishes his degree, preaches at a variety of places over the next several years. He also worked as a tutor at Yale College. but eventually moves to Massachusetts to help his grandfather with ministerial duties, congregation in the city of Northampton. His grandfather was a man named Solomon Stoddard, Stoddard, who was one of the architects of the Halfway Covenant. So Stoddard was influential in the development of that. Stoddard was also one of these individuals who had been preaching this kind of emotional type of approach and revivalistic type of approach. Not huge success, but has some success. And so Edwards is probably learning some of this from him as well. In 1729, his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, passed away, and Edwards became the sole minister of the church there in Northampton. It seems like it's at this time he becomes much more Calvinist, or much more, he's a Calvinist up to this point. But as I mentioned, a lot of his early sermons are these kind of optimistic, emphasizing beauty of God. But after his grandfather's death, he becomes much more strongly Calvinist in his preaching. Is very concerned that the theology that's developing in New England is very liberal, very what we may call Arminian. Arminian is often contrasted to Calvinism, emphasizing the ability of human beings to participate in their salvation. So the idea that there can be some choices, and that predestination is more about God seeing what human beings would decide rather than specifically choosing. So Edwards makes this switch, but he still emphasizes the importance of God's grace, the impact that God's grace has on a human soul. And in the middle of the 1730s, his congregation begins experiencing this great revival. There's people joining the church. There are people, becoming a part of the congregation that are having these emotional connections, and so he is very encouraged by this, and begins writing some things. And we'll talk about some of the writings that he has. But one of the first that really becomes well known is a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God, that basically describes what is taking place in Northampton, what led to it, some of the results. And this book becomes very well known internationally. It's not just something that becomes known in the colonies, but is read in Great Britain and other places. And many people look to Edwards as a model of evangelism. But by the 1730s, things start to cool off between Edwards and the church. And so the great experience that he's been having begins to change. And there's a couple of things that develop. One is that the Northampton church builds a new building. And in building that building, they began to give preferred seating in the building to the wealthy in the town. And Edwards is very dissatisfied with this practice. He preaches against it. He makes it known that he doesn't like this, that the wealthy are getting the best seats. And so there's that tension between him and the church. Toward the later part of the 1730s, a lot of the people that had converted in the early revivals don't really seem to be holding on to that. They don't seem to be exhibiting godly behavior. They don't seem to be as concerned about religion as they were in the previous years. And so he's convinced that many of those conversions were false conversions. And so, that concerns him as well. In the 1740s, he tries to bring revival back. There is some experience of revival with a man named George Whitefield who kind of tours through. We'll talk more about Whitefield here in a little bit, but Whitefield comes through, and Edwards kind of works with him, and there is some revival that does take place. And out of this fervor, Edwards preaches what is perhaps his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, this is his most famous sermon. It's known in religious history. It often shows up in anthologies of early American literature. So it is a pretty important piece. But when it's originally preached, it doesn't really have that much impact on the Northampton church. When he preaches it in a nearby town, though, the people have these very strong emotional responses. They moan and shriek and weep. They cry out for salvation. They cry out about their fears of going to hell. And, there's this great emotional change that takes place. And Edwards believes, that the revivals are important here. But this sermon is quite different than his other sermons we talked about warmth and beauty. And there is a very strong judgment here. I mean, there's discussion of God's grace, but it's a lot of focus on God's judgment, God's attention to the depravity of human sin. And what's really interesting is that it causes this great emotional response, but it is from the words itself, because evidently Edwards is a pretty dry speaker. He reads a lot of his notes. He's pretty monotone, but the people are weeping and wailing. So he says things like, there is the dreadful pit of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide gaping mouth open, and you have nothing to stand upon, nor anything to take hold of. There's nothing between you and hell but the air. It is only the power and mere pleasure of God that holds you up. Your wickedness makes you heavy, makes you as it were heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure toward hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf. And your healthy constitution and your own care and prudence and best contrivance and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. Were it not for the sovereign pleasure of God, the earth would not bear you one moment, for you are a burden to it. The creation groans with you. The creature is made subject to the bondage of your corruption, not willingly. The sun does not willingly shine upon you to give you light to serve sin and Satan. And the world would spew you out were it not for the sovereign hand of him who has subjected it in hope. There are the black clouds of God's wrath now hanging directly over your heads, full of the dreadful storm and big with thunder. And were it not for the restraining hand of God, it would immediately burst forth upon you. The sovereign pleasure of God for the present stays his rough wind. Otherwise it would come with fury, and your destruction would come like a whirlwind, and you would be like the chaff on the summer threshing floor. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. It is to be ascribed to nothing else that you did not go to hell the last night, that you would suffer to awake again in this world after you closed your eyes to sleep, and there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose in the morning, but that God's hand has held you up. There is no other reason to be given why you have not gone to hell, since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn worship. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down into hell. And, we can see kind of how this would tug at the emotions of people and thinking about how much God despises them in their depravity. Now, certainly, there is the notion of God's grace and the transformation and the love God has, which, is seen in other sermons. For example, another one of Edwards' famous sermons is a Divine and Supernatural Light, which talks more about those kind of ideas of beauty and grace and the wonders of heaven. But Edwards is more well known for his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But with the response that people give to sinners and other sermons, Edward, he continues to support the revivals, write about them, preach about them, especially because of the opposition that develops. And again, we'll talk more about that opposition in a little bit. But there's growing opposition, so he continues to write about that. And he's also concerned about the idea that some would have that simply emotion is a significant marker or even the sole marker that one is religious. And so he's concerned that that's the case because he's seen that earlier with Northampton of, here they were very emotional, but within a few years, there's not this great transformation. So the emotions themselves aren't completely evidence of a change. And Edwards, where he's different than some others, is he attempts to kind of really develop an intellectual approach to the religious affections or the religious emotions. Affections and emotions are kind of interchangeable terms here. And so he writes this treatise to try and say, here are the ways we can understand religious emotions, religious affections, to understand, is this truly a religious emotional response or just a emotional response? And one of the things that he points out very early on in the work is that true religion in great part consists in holy affections. What does he mean? Well, if you are truly a Christian, you are going to have emotional connection with God, and you're going to have emotional experiences. Those emotional experiences are going to be holy, which means that not all emotional experiences are holy, and not all emotional experiences are necessarily religious. So Edwards then lays out some of his views of what are some things that demonstrate true things that are truly religious and things that aren't religious. So what are some things that are not signs of religious affections or religious emotions? So, if I'm a Christian and I see these things in my life, I shouldn't automatically assume that these are religious in nature. Simply because your emotions are heightened, what he calls raised emotions, simply because you have a lot of emotion, doesn't necessarily mean that what you're experiencing is a religious emotion, right? Raised emotions by themselves do not demonstrate holiness. Having an effect on the body. We talked about how people responded to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, of weeping and wailing, sometimes passing out. Just because an emotion has some sort of bodily effect doesn't mean that it's religious. It could be just a regular type of emotion. Simply looking like love, it has the appearance of love. That by itself, again, doesn't represent that this is a religious emotion that you're experiencing. Okay, so these things don't necessarily demonstrate religious emotion. So what are some signs that that this is a true emotion or a religious emotion? Well, one thing that Edwards emphasizes is that a true emotion or a true religious emotion is going to come from outside. It is going to be God working on the heart. It is not going to be from anything that a human being has done. So even though you have these preachers, including Edwards, who are preaching these sermons that are kind of directed towards, uh, raising emotions, there must be God's activity through the Holy Spirit on the heart of the individual for this to really be a true religious emotion. Otherwise, it's not godly. It's not a holy emotion. Additionally, true emotions, true affections are excellent in themselves and not because of self-interest. Right? So a feeling, but it makes me feel good, is not evidence of a true emotion, right? And so it's not about just making me feel good. It's excellent in and of itself for me to have this experience, right? And so irrespective of what it does for me, right? So if I kind of selfishly want this feeling, then what I'm feeling is not a true religious emotion. True affections lead to a change of nature, right? So this is 1746 he's writing this. Several years removed from those early revivals in Northampton, seeing a lack of change in his congregation. And so, he wants to emphasize that, these emotions lead to changes in who people are. Again, a lot of that have to be understood in the context of this is the divine nature working on this, or divine spirit working on this. There is an ascetic quality to the emotions. They're symmetrical. Right? And he kind of means this idea of, there's a symmetry between your emotion and, the change in nature. They're proportional. Right? It's not necessarily this kind of huge overflowing of emotion, but there is a beauty in how emotional you are. And then finally, it leads to Christian practice. Right? Again, all of this is divine, and so it moves the person having their change of nature, having more beauty in their lives after that change of nature and symmetry, but also then that Christian practice. Edwards's reputation continued to grow internationally. And some of that attention he would give attention to in his sermons, talking about international events and news, and try to talk about them in his sermons. But he continues to have some tensions between him and the congregation there in Northampton. There was immorality being practiced by people. There were things going on economically in the town where the poor were being, were being oppressed, and Edwards preaches against these things. Well, the church, kind of responds to him. They demand that he give an account of how he is spending the funds he receives from the church as a salary, right? So there's this back and forth that goes on, and eventually he is dismissed or fired in 1750. In his last sermon, which you can read, he basically preaches to the church that on the day of judgment, both he and the congregation will appear before Christ and have to give an account on what had happened with Edwards. Basically God is going to call them to account for how they treated him, and that he's going to be vindicated. Really interesting last sermon to preach on your way out the door. You're going to have to face God for how you treated me. He ends up preaching for a small congregation, but also is interested in evangelizing Native Americans. He is eventually asked to become the third president of the College of New Jersey, what's now Princeton. And so he arrives there, and there's smallpox breakout. And so Edwards decides to take the inoculation, but the inoculation is actually infected, and he gets sick and dies in 1758 after several weeks of illness. Edwards has been extremely influential in the history of American Christianity, and has shaped a lot of thinking and preaching of a variety of individuals and ministers throughout the scope of American religious history. Another of these revivalists, and perhaps the one that's the most effective at his time, is a man named, so we're switching here from Edwards, who is important theologically, to one who was very, very effective at his time, a man named George Whitefield. Whitefield grew up in England, was born in England, and actually grew up around the theater. Was close to the theater, in the theater, does some acting when he was younger, but it would eventually kind of condemn the theater as immoral. He studies at Oxford to become a priest, and while there he encounters two brothers, John and Charles Wesley. The three of them and some others kind of create this what gets called a Holy Club. And in the Holy Club, they are engaging in Bible study, they're engaging in weekly communion, they are encouraging each other to live faithful lives. They get a very negative reputation from people, thinking that they think they're more holy than others, and so they're called the Holy Club. This is the group that will eventually, well, not the group, but it's out of these actions that the Methodists will be formed. And so this is kind of an early version of that for the Wesleys, and so they'll eventually kind of take some of these things and develop Methodism out of it. Both the Wesleys and George Whitefield will remain connected with the Church of England throughout their lives, even though Wesley is associated with the creation of the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church doesn't become a separate group until after the American Revolution. In many respects, what we see with George Whitefield is a transition from these local awakenings to kind of more of a pan-colonial awakenings. So Whitefield is training to become a preacher. He becomes a traveling evangelist, and he prefers preaching to encourage people to experience this emotional response. Tended to preach without notes, unlike other Anglican clergy. But he's also referred to as the Grand Itinerant because of his travels. And between 1738 and 1770, he took 5 tours of the colonies and visited every colony in what would become the United States. So he speaks to a wide variety of colonies. He would make 5 preaching tours, preached over 7,500 sermons, both here and in England. Because of Whitefield's preaching, which was open towards more than just the Anglican Church. A lot of Anglican churches in the colonies barred him from preaching there. And so Whitefield was one of these who would preach to anybody, anywhere. And he would preach to these interdenominational crowds, very large, and he would preach in the open air. He would preach in other church buildings for other denominations. He spoke to crowds of 8,000, 12,000, even 20,000 people. It's estimated that at least a quarter of the people in British North America heard Whitefield speak. So he was very, very popular. He influenced thousands of people. Was very animated, waving his arms, pointing at people. That reflected this change in preaching style. Whitefield would explicitly appeal to the emotions of people. He wanted people to emotionally respond. He was extemporaneous, as I mentioned. He would use little to no notes in his preaching. He would certainly have some, work some outlines and some writings, but he was predominantly focused on, just kind of preaching to the people. He was very animated. He was very animated and energetic in his preaching. He, even though he condemned the theater, he definitely had some influence from the theater. Right? So he emphasized the idea of the need for a new birth, and would kind of enact a new birth there on the stage, right? This new birth that's taking place, and emphasize this experience against the traditional Anglican approach, which was about conforming to doctrine and practice. Whitefield would also remove references to classical learning. A lot of ministers at the time would have references to various Greek and Roman philosophers, legal scholars, and Whitefield just got rid of all of that. Didn't think that any of that would be helpful. And he was also a very charismatic speaker. The statement was that he could bring audiences to tears simply pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. Right? Now, again, exaggerated, but it does reflect just how much he was able to move people. So, for example, Whitefield becomes pretty popular, as I mentioned, and even others who were not necessarily Christian would recognize his popularity. And the reason that took place was Whitefield was very astute when it came to publicity and kind of making some preparations for people to have these large crowds. Um, he would publish his journals where, he would keep these journals of these places that he was preaching in, and he would have them published, and they would be published in newspapers or bound together and sold. And it was a lot about what he was doing at the various places, the people he encountered, and these were pretty popular. And so people that were, you know, waiting for him to come, the heightened interest in him would rise. He would publicize his meetings, right, sending information to newspapers or to other opportunities to kind of build awareness that he was coming to town, and people would, just he would use essentially what we call public relations to build his image, and people would flock to see him, travel long distances so they could hear Whitefield preach. Ben Franklin, for example, goes to hear him preach. And he is in one of these open air spaces, and Franklin kind of moves throughout the crowd and kind of measures the space and estimates that as many as 30,000 people at a time could have heard Whitefield, right? So he's kind of moving throughout the crowd. How well can he still hear him? And kind of, what's the square area of the space? And Franklin also represents how influential Whitefield could be. Franklin was certainly a religious man to some extent, believed in God, believed that God was active in the world, but wasn't what we might call a Orthodox Christian, right? Someone that was truly committed to the fullness of Christianity. He certainly had questions about whether Jesus was divine or not. He kind of didn't believe that Jesus was actually God in human form. But he becomes becomes associated with Whitefield. They become friends. But there's an interesting event that demonstrates the impact of Whitefield. So at one point, Whitefield starts an orphanage in Georgia. And in this orphanage, he needs support for it. So one of the tours he's taking, he's trying to raise finances for this. And Whitefield writes in his, Benjamin Franklin writes in his autobiography about going to hear Whitefield, absolutely convinced he is not going to provide any support for Whitefield's orphanage. And as Whitefield preaches and talks about this orphanage, it so affects Franklin that by the end he is pulling out his pockets. He's looking for any sort of money that he can, that he can give to this orphanage. That's how persuasive Whitefield was. Whitefield is, there's some problematic things to Whitefield, not just, we might have an issue with some of his theology, but Whitefield also did own slaves, owned some slaves on a plantation in Georgia, used the slave labor for the benefit of the orphanage. So, he does have a problematic reputation as well, we would say, right? So he does have a significant impact on Christianity in the United States, but there is also this way in which he's entangled in the slave system of the 18th century. So, he certainly has some aspects that, that we wouldn't laud. That even though he's spreading the message of Christianity, there are some things, some short-sighted things within his own life, as there are with any human actor. So I don't want to valorize Whitefield, and I don't want to fully condemn him in the sense of he should have known better, although perhaps he should have known better. But history is a complex facet that sometimes people we want to admire for their actions, we also have to reckon with poor decisions, with things that, looking back now, we might consider immoral. And so, Whitefield does have a problematic lineage. It does have a problematic reputation. I can't think of the word I'm looking for here, but there are a lot of things problematic about Whitefield as well. We've already kind of touched on this, but not everyone was in support of the awakenings and the revivals. We've mentioned Gilbert Tennant's danger of an unconverted ministry, and talks about, people are avoiding talking about original sin, justification by faith. They've not themselves had the experience that they should be encouraging, which of course, led to a lot of opposition of, him calling out ministers. Sometimes there were revivalists that took to, kind of some extremes. For example, a man named James Davenport, who was a preacher in Rhode Island and Connecticut. He starts preaching against what he calls these unconverted ministers. He gets arrested for what's called itinerant preaching. We mentioned that already, but going around preaching instead of being located in a church. Whitefield got around that because of some of the things with the church he was with in England. He's released. He goes to Boston, Massachusetts, does the same kind of things. He's declared to be insane, and he's kicked out of Boston. At another place, he encourages the burning of books, wigs, rings, has a whole list of things he considers to be vain, and that people that are, have these things are vanity, encourages them to kind of bring them all and burn them. Some claim that he decided his pants were vain and tried to burn them as well. So just kind of a really extravagant, over-the-top approach to this. And so a lot of people that were against the awakenings pointed to things like that and said, look, this is really what these revivals are about. Later, Davenport recanted some of those things and settled into a located ministry, but the damage had really been done already. And even Whitefield in his journals was also very antagonistic towards some of these things and some of these ministers that were old lights, that were anti-revivalists. In one journal he writes, how can dead men beget living children, right? These dead men being these unconverted ministers, these people that haven't had the new birth experience. And so Whitefield, wrote similar things like that about a variety of ministers, sometimes, actually saying them by name. That causes problems as well. In New England, where a lot of the early revivals take place, one of the opponents to the awakenings was a man named Charles Chauncey, and so he's not the only opposer, but we'll talk about him just to kind of give an example. So he writes a work called Enthusiasm Described and Cautioned Against. And talks about people are wailing, swooning, fainting, rolling on the floor. And so, he really believes that there's some problems with these emotional responses. Not only are they foolish in his mind, not only are they disorderly in his mind, it also kind of undermines church authority in that you have all these kind of preachers like a James Davenport and others that are popping up claiming to be ministers, claiming to have all these things. And so the authority of a specific church is problematic. You have these cases of these new revivalists lacking training. They don't have education. They're kind of trying to go above their station, so there's a little bit of a class issue here as well. There's a rejection of revivalism by the faculties of Harvard and Yale, right? So the elites of society are against this. So there's a lot of this concern that the revivals are going to undermine church authority and cause problems in society in general. In opposition to it, and kind of to say, okay, well, this is what religion is supposed to be about. Chauncey emphasized it's supposed to be rational, it's supposed to be moral. These are the kind of things that religion is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about these emotional experiences. God is not a God of disorder. God is a God of order, and things should be orderly. And so that was a large part of some of the opposition that took place in New England. Some of the opposition that we see in the South is slightly different. Now, there's some that's the same in that it's, there's this opposition to emotionalism, but there's also some very distinct class differences in the South. In the South, a lot of people who would be in the upper classes would be Anglican from the Church of England. It was in the lower classes where you found more of these evangelical denominations, Baptists, Presbyterians, some of what are eventually going to become the Methodists. And so there's a class difference. The awakenings take place in the lower classes. The revivals take place in the lower classes. And so there's the Anglican approach. And so, there's quite a bit of tension there class-wise. A lot of the evangelicals that are preaching against the immorality of the rich. And in many respects, the evangelical revivalists in this 18th century are largely more egalitarian. They are preaching to slaves in the South. They are preaching against the rich. They are much more open to equality than they will be in the 19th century, right? So there's this great switch that takes place because a lot of the people that are most supportive of slavery in the South in the 19th century are Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists. So there's a change that takes place that eventually a lot of these groups that are becoming popular from the revivalist standpoint will become part of, the status quo, part of the order that's keeping African Americans enslaved. Another problem that anti-revivalists had in the South was that the revivalist preachers were not licensed by the Church of England. According to colonial law, they had to be licensed in the colony to be preaching. And so here you have these revivalist preachers, again, without education, many of them, without training, no license, going around preaching against the rich. So there's some opposition there. And as I mentioned, of course, the preaching of equality was especially offensive in the South because of the importance of slavery. Even though, as we mentioned, some revivalists had slaves. But there were a lot of revivalists in the South as these awakenings continue that were open to preaching equality. So this development of a revivalism is doing a couple of things. It's leading to the rise of evangelicalism, stressing this personal religious experience, the interior, the focus on religious piety rather than theological controversy, but it leads to a lot of doctrinal diversity as well, as we've seen. So great changes take place in the 18th century in some of the Protestant expressions of religion that will continue to have an impact throughout the history of American Christianity. And we'll explore that more in a later lesson.